In July 1926, a newspaper editor stepped outside his home in Canton, Ohio, and walked toward his car. Gunmen were waiting in the dark. Don Mellett died on his own driveway. The following year, his newspaper received the Pulitzer Prize for exposing collusion between city authorities and the criminal underworld. Men were convicted of his murder. A police chief was sent to prison. Then the case against that chief collapsed. Tonight, we will follow the investigation from Mellett's printing press to the men who arranged the attack and ask a question the verdicts never completely answered: who truly ordered his death? This story has three layers. The first is the public record. An editor challenged vice, gambling, and police corruption, received threats, and was assassinated. The second is the criminal case. A bootlegger, a hardware dealer, an imported gunman, and a former police detective were pulled into the same conspiracy. The third is the institutional question. The prosecution said the plot reached the chief of police. An appellate court found serious problems in that trial, and a second proceeding ended in acquittal. We can trace the people who carried the violence. The more difficult task is deciding where the chain of protection ended. Dark past. We reopen the files that history never fully closed. In the middle of the 1920s, Canton was an industrial Ohio city of factories, busy streets, and fast growth. It was also living under national prohibition. Alcohol had not disappeared. It had moved into illegal supply lines protected by money, intimidation, and selective enforcement. Gambling rooms and vice businesses survived because someone sold the product, someone collected the profit, and someone decided when the law would look away. Not every officer was corrupt, and not every city official served the underworld, but the structure was strong enough to become part of daily political life. This was the city Don Mellett entered in January 1925. Mellett came from an Indiana newspaper family. He had written, edited, managed advertising, and owned a small paper before moving through Akron to Canton. The Canton Daily News belonged to James Cox, a former governor of Ohio and the Democratic presidential nominee in 1920. The paper was losing ground to its larger rival, the Repository. Mellett promised to make it relevant again. He did not begin with a secret informant or a dramatic midnight raid. He began with the newspaper itself. Headlines, editorials, names, and questions printed where the entire city could read them. The circulation began to rise. So did the cost of every accusation. Under Mellett, the Daily News attacked alleged corruption in the police department, failures in the school system, and political influence inside a local hospital. The most dangerous subject was the relationship between law enforcement and the vice economy. Mellett argued that gambling, bootlegging, and criminal businesses could not operate so openly without protection. His campaign placed Police Chief Serenus Lengel under intense scrutiny. The chief was suspended for a time, fought back, and was later reinstated. A libel action followed the newspaper's attacks. Mellett was no neutral observer floating above Canton politics. He used his paper as a weapon for reform. That made him effective, controversial, and increasingly exposed. Behind the respectable storefronts stood men who benefited from the city's hidden economy. Ben Rudner operated an automobile accessory business in nearby Massillon, but investigators and later court testimony placed him inside the bootlegging world. Louis Mazer was another local figure connected to illegal liquor. Floyd Streitenberger had served as a Canton police detective. These men did not need to belong to one formal organization with a membership list. Protection networks work through introductions, favors, warnings, and shared risk. Mellett's reporting threatened more than individual reputations. It threatened the space in which business, crime, and authority could cooperate without public inspection. The pressure moved from the newspaper office to the Mellett home. Institutional accounts described prank calls, offers of money, and threats that became steadily more direct. Mellett told friends that he believed his life was in danger. A guard was assigned to protect the house. For a short time, the family lived with an armed reminder that an editorial campaign could reach their front door. Then the guard was removed. Mellett continued working. That decision is often described as fearlessness. It may also have contained something more ordinary, the belief that public visibility offered protection, that killing a newspaper editor would be too reckless even for Canton's underworld. If he believed that, he was wrong. Another death may have brought the threat into focus. In 1921, underworld informant Paul Kitzig was murdered after helping authorities in a case involving bootlegger Ben Rudner. The killing remained unresolved for years. By 1926, Mellett believed he had found a path back to Rudner. The Indiana Journalism Hall of Fame says he was investigating the Kitzig case and gathering material about Rudner's alleged responsibility. Historian Thomas Crowell's reconstruction adds an important restraint. Mellett had a damaging lead, but he still needed corroboration. The documentary version is tempting, a finished exposé waiting on the editor's desk. The evidence gives us something less convenient, a story still being built. An unpublished investigation can be more dangerous than a published one, because no outsider knows what it contains. Mellett's source reportedly described a paid killing, but the source had credibility problems. Mellett understood that printing an accusation without support could destroy the case and the newspaper with it, so he waited and checked. We do not possess a recovered final article proving exactly what Mellett planned to publish. We cannot say that one document caused his death, but the men around Rudner could not know how much evidence Mellett already had. If they believed publication was close, uncertainty itself became a motive. The editor did not need to hold the entire truth. He only needed to appear close enough to it. Late on the 15th of July, Mellett was at home with his family and visitors. Sometime after midnight, he stepped outside to move or put away his car. The house stood quiet. The guard who had once watched the property was no longer there. Accounts placed the attackers in darkness near the home, positioned to see the driveway without exposing themselves. This was not a chance robbery. Nothing suggests an argument that suddenly became violent. The target, location, and timing had been selected in advance. Mellett walked toward the garage. Inside the house, his wife, Florence, and their children were only a short distance away. Then the shooting began. Several shots crossed the property. One bullet passed into the house. Another struck Mellett in the head. He fell near the car before anyone inside could reach him. The gunman escaped into the night. Don Mellett was 34 years old. He left Florence and 4 children. The physical scene was brief. Darkness, revolver fire, a body beside the driveway, and no attacker waiting to be identified. But the motive appeared to cover the entire city. News of the assassination traveled nationally. Editors treated it as more than one local homicide. A journalist had been killed after accusing public authority of protecting criminals. The institution expected to solve the murder was the same institution Mellett had placed under suspicion. Local officers began the first investigation, but every delay created doubt. If the police department was innocent, it still carried a conflict of credibility. If anyone inside it had helped the plotters, that person could see the investigation from within. The Stark County prosecutor turned outside the city for help. Private detective Ora Slater arrived from Cincinnati. Slater did not discover one perfect clue at the driveway. He worked outward through conversations, criminal relationships, and the people who had been asked to participate. The case began to change shape. It was no longer only a search for the man who fired. It became a search for introductions. Who found the gunman? Who supplied the weapon? Who promised protection? And who wanted Mellett frightened into silence? The names formed a chain. Ben Rudner knew men in the local underworld. Louis Mazer could connect people and resources. Patrick Eugene McDermott and Steve Kaschik were outsiders looking for paid criminal work. Floyd Streitenberger carried the authority and knowledge of a former police detective. Testimony did not make every relationship equally certain. Some men accused one another to reduce their own responsibility. Deals, fear, and self-preservation shaped the statements. But several accounts converged on one basic conclusion: the attack was arranged. The gunman had not independently decided to visit Mellett's home. Someone local selected the editor. Someone brought outsiders to Canton. Someone made them believe the job could be done safely. Crowell's historical reconstruction argues that the first plan was an assault, a paid beating intended to stop or punish Mellett, and that the operation escalated into murder. That distinction matters legally and historically. A man hired to frighten an editor may still carry a loaded revolver. A plot designed to preserve deniability can become lethal in seconds. Later testimony described discussions about men willing to beat someone for money. It also described a gun being supplied and assurances that the police would not interfere. The surviving record supports planning, but it does not give us a clean recording of the final order. Was Mellett always meant to die? Or did men who planned violence later pretend they had intended something less? McDermott became the most visible missing piece. He was an ex-convict from Pennsylvania, accused of serving as the imported gunman. While Rudner and Mazer faced questioning, McDermott disappeared. Contemporary reports said he lived under protection in Cleveland, moving carefully and avoiding daylight exposure. Detective Slater worked through McDermott's family. Reports from the period describe his brothers drawing him toward Pennsylvania with news concerning their mother, then giving investigators access to him. When McDermott realized what had happened, he accused his own brothers of betraying him. His arrest gave the public a face for the assassination. It did not automatically reveal every person above him. The prosecutions produced a series of life sentences. McDermott was convicted as the hired gunman. Rudner and Mazer were convicted for their roles in arranging the crime. Streitenberger was also convicted in connection with the plot. Their cases turned conversations, introductions, and underworld testimony into a legal structure. The state argued that this was not merely a murder committed by one violent outsider. It was a local conspiracy that recruited him. The verdicts answered who carried the plot close to Mellett's driveway. But Streitenberger's testimony pushed the case higher. He implicated the man Mellett had repeatedly challenged in print: Police Chief Cyranus Lengel. In 1927, Lengel was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation of mercy. For Mellett's supporters, the verdict appeared to confirm his central warning. The protection system did not merely include criminals and a corrupt former detective. It reached the head of the police department. Then, the legal foundation shifted. An appellate court granted Lengel a new trial. Contemporary reporting cited insufficient evidence, errors in the judge's instructions, improper testimony, and concern about a juror's prior statement. At the second trial, the judge directed an acquittal. Lengel was later restored as police chief. The first verdict cannot be erased. Neither can the acquittal. Now separate the levels of proof. The murder was organized. Local men connected an outside gunman to a selected target. Rudner had a strong motive if he believed Mellett was closing in on the Kitzig murder. Mazer and Streitenberger appeared inside the planning chain. The prosecution's attempt to place Lengel at the top did not survive the courts. That may reflect a weak case, unreliable accomplice testimony, trial errors, or a system difficult to prove from the inside. The evidence does not permit us to declare Lengel the mastermind. It also does not reduce the crime to one gunman acting alone. The most honest answer lies between those claims. The attack emerged from a protection network whose complete hierarchy was never established. Across the country, newspapers responded as though the bullets had crossed more than one driveway. Trade publications and front pages described Mellett's death as an attempt to suppress journalism through violence. Editors demanded an investigation that local influence could not quietly close. The reaction increased pressure on Ohio authorities and helped make the case nationally visible. It also transformed Mellett into a symbol. Symbols can simplify people. Mellett had political commitments, commercial ambitions, and a paper fighting for circulation. None of that weakens the central fact. He used a local newspaper to expose public wrongdoing. The people threatened by that work answered with organized violence. In 1927, the Canton Daily News received the Pulitzer Prize for public service. The official citation praised the paper's fight against a condition created by collusion between city authorities and the criminal element. It also acknowledged the tragic result, the assassination of editor Don Mellett. The award belonged formally to the newspaper, not to Mellett as an individual recipient. But his absence defined it. On the first anniversary of the murder, a cornerstone was laid for a new daily news building dedicated to his memory. The paper itself later declined, was sold, and eventually disappeared. The institution did not survive forever. The record it created did. Don Mellett's murder was solved at the level of gunman and organizer. It was never fully resolved at the level of institutional protection. McDermott, Rudner, Mazer, and Streitenberger were punished. Lengel was convicted, granted a new trial, and acquitted. The Pulitzer record confirmed that collusion between authorities and criminals was not merely Mellett's private obsession. What remains uncertain is the upper boundary. Who authorized the final violence? Who expected the police to look away? And whether every responsible person ever entered a courtroom. Do you believe the surviving evidence shows that the murder reached into the police department? Or does Lengel's acquittal mark the limit of what can honestly be claimed? Write your verdict in the comments. If this forgotten case deserves to be remembered, like the video and subscribe to Dark Past. Follow Dark Past channel for the next file.